So in this video, I wanted to expand the modular building system that I've shown in the past, giving new options to build more complex structures that also work with existing tiles. Welcome to the archive. My name's Matt. My first goal with this expansion was to not have to make special diagonal tiles for things like doorways, arched walls, or any other special walls that I might make in the future. I also wanted to avoid having to make special walls to allow for extended diagonal walls, which would need one or even two flat edges, often on opposite sides. Not to mention diagonal walls that fit into combined concave convex corners with sloped ends going in different directions. Doing all of these would require 9 different variants for each different type of wall, and even just counting walls, arched windows, and doorways, that would be 28 different pieces. Which is why, instead of simply making diagonal walls, I made these 4 pieces in pairs to work with all wall variants. Okay, so quick note here. I realised right at the end that these are actually pointless, and you can just use a single one of these instead, because these pieces are only ever used to connect 2 diagonal tiles. Moving along. The diagonal ends allow us to join normal walls at a convex angle, and the smaller 1.5 inch diagonals allow you to do small convex angles with half walls to make smaller diagonal corners, perfect for narrow octagonal towers and so on. On top of that, the smaller variants also allow you to do concave corners on larger walls like this. Though to make this work, I ended up accepting some slight misalignment rather than making a whole new set of pieces specifically for corners like this. The flat extensions allow the pieces to connect diagonally to other diagonal walls for longer diagonal walls, and the smaller variant does the same thing for half walls, mainly because if you used full walls here, they wouldn't quite line up magnetically. All of these connect normal walls to a diagonal floor tile, with a floor magnet connection in the centre lining up with the standard wall. Getting them in the right place on the floor tiles is pretty easy to measure, but I've also made an STL jig for patrons, including one for 1.5 inch diagonal floors. A nice little bonus to these diagonal floors is you can not only use these tiles to make interesting layered floors, but you can also use them to add lines into the floor if carefully placed, like in corners or diagonally around an altar, or just use them as extra square floor tiles. Making these pieces is extremely straightforward. The floor tiles use the exact same method as my other floor tiles, either from the Getting Started video or the more advanced magnetic version from the Patreon bonus video. This is the method that I used for mine, mainly because it works with the various magnetic pieces that I've shown how to make, as well as any STLs I've had Fabio design for patrons. Actually, probably worth mentioning here, seeing as I'm showing off these magnetic interior walls from the bonus video anyway, these diagonal designs also work perfectly for them if you slice off the bottom ½ inch and add in another pair of magnets. I added these in line with the other vertical magnets that I show later in the video, which also means even interior versions of these walls can stack. The only difference with these floors from standard square floors is cutting them perfectly diagonally, which I did using these foam jigs, which you can make using a square of foam cut in half diagonally with a knife, making sure that the cut is straight and vertical without foam sticking out underneath, and trimming off any excess foam below the straight cut if you need to. You can then hot glue these with the corners touching to another strip of foam while flat against the table to make sure that it's right angled, making sure that the ruler cut edges are on top and smooth with the flat strip, and voila, jig. I also snip the tips off to give any cut a clean path, but that's somewhat optional. When you cut, it'll cut them off anyway. Now, you could cut all of your tiles by hand like this, but that is much more prone to human error, and you could end up with all of your tiles not quite lining up when you come back to them. Actually, speaking of floor tiles by hand, a patron of mine called Leafina recently showed how you can make a Lego jig to help cut perfectly straight ½ inch floor tiles using a knife. Hopefully this can be helpful and let some of you guys who are maybe a little bit on the fence get started. Floor tiles aside, the walls are also super simple. You start with a normal ½ inch thick wall tile, either the one that I show in the original magnetic building system video or the updated smaller brick magnetic version from the Patreon bonus video. We only want the wall cut and beveled at this point. Textures and magnetic bits and pieces come later. What can make this stage a lot easier and faster are the new wall stamp STLs that I designed with Fabio, which are part of the Patreon welcome pack, and can be used with a vise to make these cuts extremely quickly. Check out my sewer tile video to find out more, but as a quick bonus tip for this, lightly sand off the hot wire skin from the foam first. It helps the stamp cut the foam easier rather than bend or tear it. Very fine grain 1000+ ish grit sandpaper helps keep this smooth and remove as little volume as possible. And once this is finished, you should also get a matte finish that will soak in paint really well, rather than gloss. Actually, while I remember, the names on screen now are the winners of the Sewer Tile STL competition, and I've replied to their comments on that video, so if you see your name, go take a look. Anyway, once you have your wall, you can either do the free method or the easy method. For the free method, you measure 1 1/16 of an inch along on one side, and 10/16 of an inch along on the other, before making a 45-degree diagonal cut using the hot wire or knife lining up the two measurements, and then make another measurement diagonally on the pointy side 1/2 an inch down, and another 13/16 of an inch from the non-pointy side, and trim that bit off with the hot wire or knife too. Alternatively, you can use this STL jig that I got made for patrons. It gets it done a lot faster and helps support the channel. Fabio's a damn useful pair of digital hands for my ideas. This has two variants, including an open-bottomed one in case for some reason you wanted to make diagonal cuts to a longer or full wall. That said, for these pieces, we use the main jig design with a bottom. You might find you need to texture your piece before slotting it into the jig, as the jig is an exact 1/2 inch across, so the texturing can help give it that little bit of extra leeway. We just slide the wall in, hook the hot wire into the little positioning loops at the end, and drag across carefully and smoothly, once from each side for a smooth, straight cut each time. This gives us two diagonal pieces from the edges of the wall, which can be cut and textured to match the rest. Speaking of texture, these STL texture rollers are also in the welcome pack, and this sharp one is designed to have a stronger impact on soft pink US foam, if that's useful to you. It also saves constantly using new tinfoil when the ball goes flat. Or you can just use that scrunched tinfoil if that works for you, although I find it's not as fast. Up to you. There is also this brick stamp indenter, which lets you, well, indent bricks. It adds detail and does what it says on the tin. Now we're left with a rather ragged, abused looking wall tile, but that's okay. We just need to clean it up a bit. Cutting the damaged edges into a nice straight 90-degree line by slotting one edge into a carpenter square and slicing, then trimming the rest off on the hot wire. I like to line it up with the edge of a brick row. Once it's smooth again, we can easily trim this down into a 5/8 of an inch piece, which is perfect for longer diagonal walls. I tend to cut these with one of the brick lines at the edge like this, so at least one side will match up to the center tile. For the 1.5 inch variants of these, we just need to trim 5/16 of an inch off from each piece on the straight edge, making them slightly smaller, otherwise they're identical. Finally, on to magnetization. Again, this is pretty straightforward, but I also used a new glue here to add the magnets to completely remove any risk of them popping back out. I was recently shown foam-safe superglue by a patron. On the right you can see what normal superglue does to foam, whereas on the left, those two smooth wet patches are foam-safe superglue. Handy stuff. A small coating of this on a magnet is usually enough to hold it in place securely, though I do still use my glue gun to melt the hole because it's very conveniently sized. The straight pieces get the usual north-south magnets on the sides, and I generally did these in pairs with the smooth brick edge facing the center wall tile, so they'd line up neatly with the main wall tiles. The diagonal side magnetization was slightly different, as I wanted at least the smaller variant to be reversible to use on larger walls inverted, so magnets weren't an option. Instead, I went with the 1mm iron nails that I've used previously for things like this. These are strong enough here for our purposes, and they can be sealed again using foam-safe superglue. They even punch their own holes. I found it easier to punch the hole and then add superglue and push in, which makes it easier to avoid sticking to your project. Using a magnet stick to hold the nail also helps. I did these in pairs too, for much the same bricks lining up with walls reason. You don't have to, it just looks better to me. Finally, to increase stability in taller structures, I added top and bottom magnets to all of the pieces, so that they wouldn't end up poking slightly in or out all over the place. To keep it cheap though, I used 2x1mm magnets here, which give just enough hold to keep it straight, which is all we need. I added all of these 1/8 of an inch in from the inner wall tile, on the flat edge closest to the middle wall connection, and made a jig for marking these in too, because why not at this point? Again, available to patrons. And that's all there is to it. A better method for magnets, a faster, easier method for wall textures, and a diagonal wall method that is cheaper, more flexible, and easier to store than any I've seen before. I've started rhyming apparently, so I'm going to wrap this up. I'm very happy with how these came out, and in future I'll be adding roof tiles to complement these new angles. But until next time, I'll be in the archive.